Hello lovelies, in this video we're going to be looking at food chains and interdependence for your GCSE biology. Now it is really important that you pay careful attention to where things are going, the energy transfers in this video, because sometimes that's an area that students get confused. So settle in, get a cup of tea, get a nice pen and let's get ready.
Hi everyone. Okay, so we're going to start looking at food chains, trophic levels, food webs, and interdependence today. So here you can see my simple food chain. I have the sun, I have some grass that's being eaten by a rabbit, that's being eaten by a snake, that's being eaten by an eagle. So we start with the sun. The sun is the source of all energy, both light energy and heat energy on Earth. Without it, we wouldn't have any food chains, we wouldn't have any organisms. Then we go to the producers. All food chains start with a plant. Plants are known as producers because they produce their own nutrients using the energy they get from the sun through photosynthesis. So they are producers. All plants are producers because they produce their own nutrients through photosynthesis. Now we come to the rabbit, which is eating our grass. The rabbit is the primary consumer. It's the first consumer. That's what we mean by primary here. So it's the first consumer in our food chain. It's a consumer because it has to eat other organisms in order to get nutrients. Okay, it can't make nutrients on its own like the plant. It is having to eat other organisms, in this case the grass, to get nutrients. The rabbit is also eating only plants, and so in this case the rabbit can also be called a herbivore because it is only consuming plants. The rabbit, if you look above to the next part of the food chain, is being eaten by the snake. This means that because it's being eaten by another organism and it is an animal, it is also a prey species. Now we have the snake. The snake is the secondary consumer, as in the word second is in there, so it's the second consumer in the food chain. And because it's consuming the rabbit, it's getting its nutrients from eating other organisms. It is also, you'll notice, they're eaten by the eagle. So as well as being a consumer, and because it consumes meat, it is a carnivore this time because it eats only meat and nothing else, but it is also being eaten by the eagle. So it's being a consumer, it's the secondary consumer, it's a carnivore, but because it's being caught and eaten by the eagle, it can also be an example of a prey species as well. Also really important to note, I mentioned prey a couple of times now. The secondary consumer can be a prey, the primary consumer can also be prey. The one thing that can never be prey are plants. Plants are producers, they are not prey. They cannot be caught and eaten by other animals. They are just plants, they are just eaten, they are producers, so they can never be described as prey. Finally, then we have our tertiary consumer, which is our eagle, which is eating the snake. So tertiary in this case meaning third, so it's the third consumer in the food chain, it is the tertiary consumer in the food chain, and it is eating the snake. Nothing is eating the eagle, so we are considering it a top or an apex predator. Nothing eats it, it's not being eaten, so it cannot be prey. It is just a predator, and again, it's also a carnivore because it eats meat. So the eagle is a tertiary consumer, the third consumer in the food chain. It eats the snake, it eats meat, so it's a carnivore, and it is not prey. It is the top or the apex predator, which means it does not have any predators itself. So you'll see part of our food chain now, but this time it's been incorporated into a food web. So a food web is a network of interconnected food chains. So food chains are often just a snapshot of part of a food web because in reality, most plant species will have lots of different animal species that eat it, and most prey species will have lots of different predators. It isn't the case that there is only one for each. So our food chain is highlighted in pink there. You can see the grass, rabbit, snake, eagle. Then we also have grass, worm, bird, snake as another food chain. We have grass, snail, bird, eagle. And we also have grass, snail, lizard, eagle. So that's just 1, 2, 3, 4 food chains in there that we can identify from this one food web. But there's some other connections and branches as well. Now, the other thing you have to be able to do with food webs is to be able to pick out those levels of the food chain. So identify carnivores, herbivores, predators, prey, and tertiary, secondary, and primary consumers and producers. So producers are easy, they're at the bottom of the food chain. So our producer here is the grass. Now we have to be able to identify the primary consumers in our food chain. So that's easy because that's everything that is eating the grass. So we've got snails, worms, rabbits. The bird also eats the grass, but it isn't a primary consumer necessarily because it's actually also playing the role of secondary consumer. So the secondary consumers would be the lizard, because that's eating another animal, which is the snail. The bird, because that's eating a primary consumer, which is the snail. The bird again, because it's eating the primary consumer, which is the worm. And we've got the snake, which is eating the primary consumer, which is the rabbit. And now we have a look at our tertiary consumer. So we've got our bird, and because that has got 2 levels below it, a primary and a secondary. So, our eagle, which is our tertiary. And then we also have the snake. So the snake can also be a tertiary consumer, because if you look at the food chain, snail, bird, snake, it is a tertiary consumer there, okay? So it is a secondary consumer in the food chain with the rabbit, but it is also a tertiary consumer. So we have 2 tertiary consumers here. We've got the eagle and the snake. And you'll notice I've coded them for you. So the little codes with 1 and a superscript kind of 0 degree sign at the top is code for primary, 2 with a little 0 is secondary, 3 with a little 0 is tertiary. But make sure in your exam that you actually write down the full word and don't use the little symbol, but I've used it here shorthand for you. Okay, so now we've got a similar food chain to the one we were talking about before, but this time we've got grass, rabbit, snake. And we're going to talk about how it demonstrates the transfer of energy. So food chains show the flow of energy. That's what the arrows represent. They are labeled energy. So the light energy comes from the sun, and the plants use that light energy from the sun for photosynthesis, where they make glucose, and they put the energy into the bonds that makes glucose, and they use that to make new cells and new tissues. So the glucose is transferred into other molecules, which we then use to make cells and tissues. This cells and tissues, the stuff that the plants are made of, is known as biomass. So plants are taking the energy and using it to make biomass. Then, when those plants are eaten by the rabbit, the energy that's trapped in that biomass in the plant tissues is transferred to the rabbit. So the rabbit gets energy and nutrients from eating the biomass of the plants. However, only about 10% of the energy that's trapped in the biomass actually makes it into the rabbit. So there's not a lot, it's not a lot of energy being transferred each time through each level of this food chain. And there's reasons for that. So you'll notice I've got arrows going up as well, labeled energy, that are leaving each organism at every level. So the energy that is taken in by the plant for photosynthesis, for example, from the sun, some of that energy is used to make glucose, but not all of it. Some of it gets reflected, some of it gets wasted, some of it gets used to evaporate water from the surface of leaves. So that's why not all of that energy then goes into making that biomass in the leaf. Same for the rabbit. The rabbit eats the grass. However, the energy it gets from those nutrients from that food is going to be used in lots of different ways. It's going to use some of it to create heat energy to keep itself warm. It's going to use some of that energy to move around, run around. And it's also going to excrete some of that as energy in the form of waste. So when the rabbit goes to the toilet in urine and in feces, he can't digest all of the plant, so some of it gets lost as waste. That means that there will then only be 10%, or there'll be even less than 10% of the original amount of energy, or 10% again coming from the rabbit into the snake. So you'll see we need to add these labels that energy is lost. That's what those arrows really mean, is that energy is lost at every level of the food chain. So there's less and less energy being passed along each time an organism is consumed by another organism. For the snake then, by the time we get to the snake, so much energy has been lost in the two levels in the food chain below it, it doesn't manage to get much energy from its food. So the higher up the food chain you go, the less energy is being transferred from your food, which often means they have to eat quite a lot. And that often means that we can't have food chains much larger than 4 or 5 levels, because there just wouldn't be enough energy to sustain those animals past that point. If there's too many levels below them, they wouldn't get enough energy from their food to survive. So over here you can see my pyramid, and we've talked about tertiary consumers, secondary consumers, primary. These are actually trophic levels. That's what they're known as. Troph comes from the Greek, I believe, which means to eat. So you can I get this idea that they are levels of eating. Okay, so these are what we call trophic levels, as well as the words we use to describe the animals that are in that level. And this pyramid is an example of a way that we can show through either pyramid of numbers, so it could be the numbers of each producer and primary consumer, or it could be biomass, so the physical amount of the producers, the consumers and the secondary consumers, or energy as well. So you can add up the amount of energy in calories, for example, and put them in the levels. And a lot of these pyramids are shown because that pyramid shape shows you how it decreases as you go up the trophic levels. It decreases as you go up the food chain. There are less organisms at each level of the food chain, and then also there's less biomass, less energy as you move up. And that's often what it's going to show. I've edited our food chain slightly. So now we have the sun going to the grass, and this time the grass is being eaten by a cow, and this time the cow is eaten by a person. So this idea of energy being lost at each level of the food chain is one of the justifications for why it is more efficient. So it is better, there's more energy being passed on in each level of the food chain if you reduce the number of steps in the food chain. So having more steps makes it less energy efficient because less energy is being transferred. So this is why there's an argument that actually it is more efficient for humans to eat plants, because there's less steps in the food chain then between us and the initial energy from the sun that's going into those plants. Less energy is wasted because there's fewer steps to get to us. So if we were to just eat plants, instead of growing the plants to then feed cows, to then eat the meat from the cows, that's lost a lot of energy in that process. If we were to just eat the plants instead, it's more efficient. You'll notice I crossed out better for more efficient, because that's the language we need to use. Okay, so interdependence is one of those big words that is in this topic that we need to be able to understand. There is a clue in the name. Inter, so interactions, and dependence, depending on each other for things. So interdependence is describing how different species within a community, that food web there demonstrates a community because there's lots of different species, the rabbit, the snail, the worm, the snake, they're all different species. They're all living in the same kind of area. It's describing how they depend on one another to survive. So although, obviously, some of them are being eaten by other organisms, they are dependent on each other for things like food. And also this is including animals and plants, not just animals. So on the right-hand side, we've got some examples. So the clownfish here living in his anemone, he is relying on that anemone for shelter. So he is dependent on that anemone because he lives in it and he depends on it for shelter. The plant is reliant on the bee and other insects for sexual reproduction, so pollination, but also other tree species and other plant species are relying on animals for dispersing their seeds. And then we have something as simple as the snail being food for the lizard. So the lizard is dependent on the snail for food. These are examples of interdependencies where one organism is dependent or reliant on the other for their survival. It can be as simple as just being, we need them as food to eat. It can be more complicated like pollination and reproduction and seed dispersal. It can be for shelter, living in a tree. You need to live in the tree. There's a specific relationship between predators and prey though. So predators and prey really do rely on each other, and the numbers of predators and prey can be changed quite drastically if one of the two are affected. For example, if the numbers of prey decrease, then the numbers of the predator will also decrease because there will be less food for that predator. So less of them will survive and reproduce. Same for the opposite way around. If a load of predators died, then the prey would be specifically less likely to be eaten because there's fewer predators, so the prey species will often increase. So we've got some examples from our food chain. So the first example is quite an easy one because there's not many interactions. If the number of rabbits were to drastically decrease because they got some kind of disease, then there would be less food for the snakes, so the snake population is likely to also decrease. Another example, this one's a little bit more complicated. If the number of birds were to decrease, again, suddenly because of disease, they all got sick and died. If the number of birds were to decrease, the first thing we could say it could have an impact on is that the number of snails and the number of worms would be likely to increase because there's less predators to eat them, so fewer of them will be dying, and therefore more of them will survive and reproduce, and so the number of snails and worms would increase. But we also have to think about looking up in the food chain above the organism that's been affected and start thinking about predators as well. So we could simply say, oh, well, the eagle will have less food, so it will decrease like we did with the snakes. But that's not accurate here because actually the eagle doesn't just eat birds according to our food chain. So what we can actually think about saying is that the number of lizards and snakes is likely to decrease because the eagle is going to have to eat more lizards and more snakes to replace the fact that one of their prey species, the birds, has decreased. Although they're in the same level as the birds, then the eagle, we're saying the eagle's been affected because it's got fewer things to eat. So that means that eagle is going to have to eat more of its other prey species. So it's going to have to eat more lizards and more snakes. So the number of those will decrease. It's also likely the number of snakes is going to decrease a lot because they also rely on eating birds. So you can kind of see how this spirals out into different layers of the food chain. But the main idea is to be able to look below what effect would it have on the organisms that animal eats, but also look up and think about what effect that's going to have on predators and their prey as well. So if a community is considered stable, it's because all of these factors, all of these interdependencies are stable. They don't change much. So their populations don't change much. Their population numbers don't change because the numbers of predators and prey don't change because everyone is reliant on everyone else, but the system is working as it should. And so these communities are often very old or have been around for a really long time. They've been stable for a long time. And one of the examples of those is coral reefs. And so you can use coral reef as an example of a stable community where these big changes in predators and prey don't really change much because everything is stable and all of their interdependencies work.
Ouch! This is why in some videos I have unexplained scratches.